Today, we're going to be continuing on our introduction to genetics, where we talk about Mendel and his pea plant experiments. Maybe many of you have already heard about these experiments in a previous science class. But what is really covered is inheritance. So before Mendel, who we'll introduce, inheritance was understood at a basic level. People knew that cows gave birth to cows, not horses, right? That's a given. Or brown dogs usually gave birth to brown dogs. But what was really lacking was an understanding of how particular traits were passed down to offspring, were passed down to children. Let's examine some genetic terminology before we proceed. A gene, that's just a hereditary element, something that's passed on to offspring, and it can be segregated. So there's a gene for every particular thing, every particular feature in your body, right? If you're talking about humans. And we talked about chromosomes with the coiled DNA and how certain bands have different genes on them. Now, an allele is a particular form or series of a gene. So a gene might have an allele, say, for brown hair, or it could have an allele for blonde hair. And moving on with this, a homozygous organism, homozygous alleles, that would be carrying two copies of the same allele. So two copies of the brown hair allele or two copies of the blonde hair allele. However, heterozygous refers to an organism carrying different alleles of the same gene. So they might have one allele for brown hair and one allele for blonde hair. And usually a gene has two alleles. Let's examine genotype versus phenotype. So genotype, we know, right, is the genetic makeup of an organism. It's the DNA, chromosomes, what you don't see. But the phenotype is what you do see, the observable characteristics of an organism. So an example of this could be tall or short, or even maybe hair color, anything you observe in an organism. Take, for example, the flamingo right here. You're seeing what its genes are dictating, what its genes are making for that organism. And look at these rabbits too, right? They're all rabbits, but they have different genotypes, which lead to them having different phenotypes. They have different appearances. So let's stop here and check for understanding. If I were to tell you an organism has brown hair, would that be an example of the organism's genotype or phenotype? Now, moving on to Gregory Mendel, the star of our lesson. He was the father of classical genetics. So he was born into a peasant family in 1822, quite a long time ago, in an Austro-Czech village. He went on to become a monk, a religious figure at an abbey, where he conducted his inheritance and genetics experiments on pea plants from 1856 to 1863. In Mendel's work, he designed his experiments and documented thousands of pea plants and their offspring. You could say, the children of the plants, or the plants that were produced from the parents, over a period of 8 years. And his research was instrumental in showing that traits, features of organisms, behaved in a precise and mathematical way. So let's stop here and check for understanding. What organism did Mendel use for his experiment? And we will be talking about this as we go on. Yeah, that's right. So Mendel used peas for his experiment to study inheritance. But how come? Why? Well, because true breeding and commercial strains were available. True breeding means that the plants produce genetically identical offspring. So the genetics, DNA, exactly the same. Peas are really easy to grow, and they grow quickly and they have a quick turnaround. So it's easy to study traits. And see, here's an example of a pea flower. And lastly, peas have traits that don't exhibit blended inheritance. That's really important. When he was showing inheritance based on a mathematical model. So pea plants, they're either tall or short. There's no medium. They're either purple or with white flower. There's no blended in between pink. So there's many pea plant traits that he studied. A particularly important one was the color, right? Purple or white. Purple we'll see is dominant, and so it's abbreviated with a capital W, while white is recessive. It's not usually seen as abbreviated with a lowercase w. Flower position, where the flowers are on the plants. The plant size, tall, that's dominant. Dwarf, short, that would be recessive, not as common. Now we can visualize Mendel's piece, right? He studied seed shape, round or wrinkled, dominant, recessive, color, violet or purple versus white, pod shape, pod color, and flower, pod, and position. So either terminal on the top of the stem or axial along the stem. So now we're going to go into the process of pollinating plants, because this was a huge part of Mendel's experiments. He needed to pollinate plants to make crosses. So think of crosses as mating, but for plants. So there's several different kinds of pollination. So true breeding plants. Let's stop here and let's see if you remember what true breeding plants are. So answer this question, please. And yes, that's right. True breeding plants self-pollinate and they produce genetically identical offspring. So here's an example of a plant self-pollinating. It pollinates itself. But with crossbreeding plants or hybrid plants, they transfer pollen from one flowering plant to another, and offspring are usually not always genetically identical. And when we talk about the pollination process of a plant, it's important to know that there are both male and female parts of a plant, right? So we have these long fibrous strands, they're called stamen, and at the top, the nodule is called the anther. That's where pollen is produced. And this vase-looking thing in the center of the plant, that it's called the pistil. That's the female part of the plant. And the very top, as you can see, the stigma accepts the pollen. So now let's go back and examine that. So let's see. So what's the male part of the plant? What's the female part of the plant? But we're going to end here today, complete this Edpuzzle, turn it in, and we will proceed with Mendel's experiments tomorrow. Thank you.